Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. We are now continuing to track all of these updates for you live out of the Middle East as we're getting more information, not only here stateside from some of the leaders and members of President Trump's administration, but also still watching to see how things are unfolding there in the Middle East and getting updates there as well. I do want to continue on that conversation with some news that we brought to you as it broke within the last hour. Putting this up on your screen from Fox News, saying there, breaking, the U.S. consulate in Dubai was hit by an Iranian drone. That was according to diplomatic sources telling that to Fox News. In fact, within the last hour, we've also had an update from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who confirmed this as well, saying that that drone struck an area in the parking lot, leading to a small fire. Of course, we want to continue on as we're watching these updates come into us here on Live Now from Fox. And so to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing now, I would like to bring in with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, Ben Cohen. Ben, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now.
Always good to be with you, Christina.
Well, Ben, we've been talking the last few days, watching these updates come in really minute by minute. A few times breaking news coming to us while we're both here on the air. But let's talk about this latest news that came in the last hour. The U.S. consulate, a small fire erupting on the outside after a drone hit from an Iranian drone. Let's take a step here to talk about the wider impact that now is being felt there in the region. Can you sort of explain to folks at home why some of these other states that are not directly involved in the conflict are now being hit by some of these retaliatory missiles?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do that. I think this is a region-wide issue for U.S. Diplomatic facilities. As you just pointed out, Christina, the embassy in Dubai was hit today. A fire there that thankfully appears to have been contained. But the U.S. is also evacuating embassy staff from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, from Lebanon, across the region. And of course, last night, the State Department issued a directive or an advisory for U.S. citizens to leave all the countries in the region, including Israel. So there's clearly a real emergency here, and the State Department is keen, obviously, to make sure that the exposure of Americans to this war and the danger of Americans being injured or killed is minimized. As to why this is happening, the U.S. locates a lot of bases and other military facilities in these countries. You know, we have Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, for example, that serves as the headquarters of CENTCOM. We have a presence in Saudi Arabia. We have a presence in Iraq. All these are countries that are in the firing line, that are in the sights of Iran's missile capabilities. And what we've seen as we enter now day 4 of the war is that Iran has been extremely willing to use its offensive weapons against these U.S. facilities. And I think it's sending a message to the region that, firstly, nowhere is safe, and that, secondly, any country, any Arab country that hosts the U.S. military is a legitimate target. So this is a direct attack on U.S. interests and on the U.S.'s foreign policy imperatives in the Middle East by the regime in Tehran.
All right, and so we're watching all of this unfold, and we appreciate that explanation. I also do want to put this up there from the U.S. Central Command, saying that the Iranian regime's killer drones have been a menace for the Middle East for years. These drones are no longer a tolerable risk, and I think that points to the fact that the United States had also earlier closed embassies, not only in other regions directly linked there, but Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Lebanon, and warned, as you said, Americans to leave some of these countries. How does this, though, speak to the uncertainty of where these next strikes could potentially be landing there in the region?
Well, I think we have a fairly clear idea of where the Iranians are hitting because their target range has already been incredibly wide. You know, we've seen hits on Israel. We've seen hits in Saudi Arabia. We've seen hits even in Qatar, which has traditionally been a friend and an ally to the Iranian regime. So I think in some ways this is Iran is behaving almost like somebody who has nothing more to lose, and that's why it's unleashing all these projectiles around the region. I think the interesting question is, how much longer can they carry on doing this? We heard President Trump saying today that a good number of their missile launchers had been knocked out. And the message that is coming out of Washington, and I think the message that is coming out of Israel, is that Iran is actually running out of projectiles. Its offensive capability is being run down. The Israelis said last year, after the war in June last year, that Iran's ambition was to assemble 8,000 ballistic missiles by 2027. They're nowhere near that amount now, and I would imagine that the supply is getting even lower because of these strikes. So I think we can certainly expect quite a few more days of these Iranian attacks. But I think at some point we're going to start noticing an acute lack of weaponry for the Iranian armed forces. And that's going to impact, obviously, their ability to carry on fighting this war.
And we're going to continue to watch how all of this unfolds as we're still learning new information about where additional strikes are coming from into Iran from the U.S. and Israel as well. I do want to put this up on the screen while we talk about where the leadership now stands there in the country. We do know that President Trump said that most of Iran's military installations have been, quote, knocked out, as you mentioned, Ben, and that new strikes today are targeting Iranian leadership. In fact, Israel also struck a compound, as demonstrated there on the screen, belonging to a nuclear compound. And then also they struck an area where there was a group assembled who was there in order to elect Iran's next supreme leader. Can you add some context here to how important these new strikes have been to impact the current government structure that still remains in some capacity there inside of the country?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because these strikes are clearly targeted both at the nuclear program and at the Iranian leadership. So these are not just random strikes. The targets are very carefully selected. Iran has this kind of Byzantine governance structure, and one of the bodies is known as the Assembly of Experts. And that's a body that is tasked constitutionally with electing the supreme leader. They met today. There are some unconfirmed reports that the son of the dead supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, Mojtaba Khamenei, is now the new supreme leader elected at that meeting. But of course, that meeting was targeted by the Israelis because I think the aim here clearly is to decapitate Iran's current leadership in terms of advancing the agenda, the project of regime change, of unseating the Islamic Republic as the governing structure of Iran and replacing it with something selected, chosen by the Iranian people themselves. Additionally, you mentioned, Christina, the nuclear targets. That's certainly true. Natanz, the main enrichment facility, its entrances were damaged today. And I am hearing talk of other targets in the nuclear program potentially being next. One of them, for example, is a facility called Talagan 2, where nuclear weapons research has been carried out. That's been hit in the past. The Iranians, it was hit last June. The Iranians have been trying to rebuild it, to build this kind of protective coating over it. So I think that is very much a candidate for further strikes, as are the other nuclear facilities. The one thing that I would add, I think is important, Christina, is that the Iranians, the Iranian regime, in terms of dealing with this onslaught from the US and Israel, they appear to now be doing what their proxies in Lebanon and Gaza, Hezbollah and Hamas, do, which is using human shields. For example, Iranian government officials have been holding press conferences inside schools in Tehran. And in fact, the Iranian Teachers Union said, pointed this out and said, we're very concerned that essentially our leaders are inviting strikes on civilian infrastructure. So I think, we're seeing reports of a growing death toll inside Iran. I think we need to look at how that death toll has come about and to what extent the regime achieved that number by using its own people as human shields.
And there, we said that there's still much developing there in the region and that this is not coming to an end as it appears at this point anytime soon. I do want to put this up on the screen as well, just to give people an idea of what's happening within the last few minutes. This is from Fox's Trey Yanks, just putting this out on his social media pages, saying that those sirens are now sounding across Tel Aviv. That's sort of indicating possibly new strikes, retaliatory strikes could be coming into the region. We'll keep our eyes on some of those cameras here on Live Now to see if we're able to bring you any of that as it happens live as well. In the meantime, though, let's talk lastly about the question of Hezbollah. I do want to put this up on your screen. This is a live vantage point for folks at home to see Beirut there in Lebanon at this point. We do know that their influence within the Middle East, for people, though, who are not necessarily familiar, what is the connection between the current government in Iran and the terrorist group ultimately that's leading to some of these strikes happening right now back and forth between Israel and Lebanon?
Well, Iran has either created or fostered a number of proxy terrorist groups around the Middle East. You see them in Iraq, you see them in Yemen, you see them in Gaza, but most of all, you see them in Lebanon because Hezbollah, Arabic for the Party of God, is very much the jewel in the crown of Iran's proxies. They have the best fighters, they are the best equipped, and they have traditionally posed the biggest threat to Israel. And so Iran, if you like, is the head of an octopus that includes various tentacles, one of which, and perhaps the most important of which, is Hezbollah. Hezbollah attacked Israel the day after the October the 7th massacre back in 2023. They did so at Iran's behest. Israel, in that interim 2-year period, made a lot of progress in diminishing Hezbollah as a threat. They carried out one spectacular operation there where pages carried by Hezbollah fighters basically exploded in their pockets, and that was the work of Israeli intelligence. They also assassinated the former head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. So the Hezbollah that we're dealing with now is down and weakened, but it's not out. And after Khamenei's elimination over the weekend, Hezbollah did threaten that it was going to attack Israel. And there are two real processes going on here. One is a military offensive by Israel, moving its troops deeper into South Lebanon, trying to take over some of that high ground to ensure that Hezbollah can't fire missiles at Israeli communities on the Israeli side of the border. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that the Lebanese government is trying as best it can, I think, to rein in Hezbollah. You had the Lebanese cabinet and prime minister announcing today that Hezbollah's military activity is banned because Lebanon is trying to move to a position where there is only one armed force in the country, and that would be the Lebanese army. Hezbollah would have to dismantle its military capabilities and give up its weapons. This is something the Americans and the Lebanese have been working together to achieve with mixed results over the last year. I think now, with this war in Iran and the possibility of a new front opening up on Israel's northern border, that task of disarming Hezbollah is becoming even more urgent.
And as you're mentioning that border, we do have a live vantage point of it right now. We're going to continue to keep our eyes on this shot as well, the border between Israel and Lebanon at this point, as that increased military operation there between Hezbollah and Israel is continuing on at this hour. So we certainly, as always, appreciate with the FDD, Ben Cohen, for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Ben, I know that you've been incredibly tired. We appreciate you for joining us here and continuing to give us these updates. Your expertise is always appreciated.
Great to be with you, Christina.
All right, so what we are going to do now is take this opportunity to slide away for a quick 2-minute commercial break. On the other side, though, we'll be getting another update here stateside. You might have been watching Live Now from Fox earlier this morning as we carried a hearing that featured Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Defense. And so I shouldn't say the Secretary there. Kristi Noem was speaking, a Homeland Security Secretary. And during that meeting that she had, she was able to be asked several questions about the Iranian factor. We'll be checking in with our own here at Live Now from Fox, Bowen Kodrovich. He'll be taking us through what happened at that hearing and some of the significant portions after this. Stay with us.